Before we start, just a reminder from last week, if you missed it, I finally released a new Skillshare class on this cozy cup of hot chocolate. I think this painting would actually pair quite nicely with today's tutorial, and you can even include the ginger cookies into the hot chocolate composition, which will be a nice compilation. If you've never been a member on Skillshare, you can use the link in my description box to get a free trial where you'll have access to all of the classes on Skillshare, including all of my classes. This includes a class on how I make my sketchbooks that I use for my YouTube tutorials, since that's a really common question that I get asked a lot. So if you're curious about that, you can look it up on Skillshare. The classes that I make on Skillshare tend to be more slow-paced and detailed because I am able to divide them up into shorter lessons, so the steps are easier to understand. And if this sounds like something you guys are interested in, you're very welcome to join me in this class. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be painting some ginger cookies in 3 shapes. I'm painting this as a whole set, but you can also separate these into single Christmas cards. So let's get right to sketching. The first thing that I did was to measure the center point vertically, and I just find it much easier to sketch out while I have the center point as guideline. Before sketching this out, I already had an idea of the shapes that I wanted to include, and since I want a gingerbread house or a ginger cookie house in the middle, I just allocated the space for it by drawing out a square. And on top of the house, I want to include a snowflake which has 6 points, so I just drew a cross which serves as guidelines for the 6 points, and at the bottom I want to draw out a gingerbread man. I did this very loosely. As you can see, the sizing's way off, but I feel like I have more or less positioned them correctly. So I'm just going to fix the size along the way little by little until I'm happy with how they will look together. I always have trouble with the proportions of drawing gingerbread man for some reason. So I just tried to make it fit into the composition. I shortened the length of the arms and legs to fit more or less with the width of the house, and I tried to clean the lines as best as I can. In terms of the snowflake cookie, it was a bit too small, so I decided to redraw the whole thing, making sure that the length of the cross or the lines for the guidelines also fit more or less the width of the house. You probably saw me making dots, which I use as guide to know where the line should end and join together, and then I made arrows on the point of each line, and I try to even it out on all sides. Even if the angle might not look correct, I just want the outline to work out. This actually turned out to be trickier than I thought it would be to draw, and it took me longer than anticipated, so I'll definitely have the outline available in my coffee shop. Lastly, I'm just going to clean the outline for the house since I find that this is the easiest to draw. So once I've established the main outline, I do want to make sure that the lines are clean because I'm going to be adding the details for the decorations. I'm just going to keep it simple for the house. I made little curved lines on top of the roof of the house, and this will just represent some snow, and the circles are to represent colorful lights later on. As for the rest of the decorations, they're going to be very simple, and I'm just going to color them white as white royal icing because I just like the look of the white icing on top of the dark ginger cookies. As for the snowflake here, this one is one of my favorites. It was super fun to draw and paint because of the pattern. There are a lot of ideas you can get from the internet as well, so you can mix and match your favorite pattern according to your liking and customize your painting. Lastly, for the gingerbread man, you can also customize this. I want mine to have a smiley face, and then I wasn't sure if I want to add here, so I just drew the couple of curved lines at first that I actually changed at the end. I also gave him blush. In terms of the clothing, you can just add buttons, you can add a bow tie. I want my gingerbread man to be toasty and warm, so I decided to give him a scarf, and I also added the classic pattern for the legs and the arms, and to finish off I also added a couple of buttons. Next, I'm going to go over the colors that I'll be using. Firstly, this is Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Gray of Grey by Holbein, Mineral Violet by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Hooker's Green by Cotman, and Vermilion by Holbein. I'm also going to be using my Marie's masking fluid. So let's begin. Since there are going to be a lot of white decorations on top of the cookies, I find that it's much easier to mask the whole decoration. So I'm just going to go over those areas with my masking fluid. This actually turned out to be quite time consuming because there are a lot of areas to cover. And since the masking fluid is quite liquidy, there were oddly a lot of air bubbles, even though I didn't shake the masking fluid prior to using. The bubbles can be quite frustrating when I'm trying to cover the really tiny areas, so when I see it coming, I like to plop it over to a scrap piece of paper, or if one appears unexpectedly, I have a needle right next to me to pop it. Saying this though, I still quite like this masking fluid because it doesn't seem to dry too fast, even in the bottle, and the tube makes the application a bit easier for these types of paintings as well. So it's a plus and minus, but these are just my experience with this masking fluid since a lot of you asked about it the last time I used this masking fluid a while back. For the roof of the house, I planned for the whole area to be white, but I don't like risking a huge area covered by masking fluid in case it rips when I take it off, so I just outline the roof, and I find that that's enough for me to remember and to avoid painting. By the way, it's nearly impossible to get clean edges for every single decorative element when covering with masking fluid at the scale. So the main thing that I try to focus on at this point is just the width of those decorative elements. And in terms of the clean edges, you can always clean it up as you paint later, but make sure that the main areas or the decorative elements are covered. So everything else is quite self-explanatory. I'm just going to keep masking the rest of the decorative elements. Once you've covered the decorations, you can leave it to dry. This took a very long time to dry, and I personally just left it and ate lunch first, so you can do something else as you wait. And once it's completely dry and tacky, we're ready to paint right on top of it. The painting process is actually really simple. There are only a few color mixtures. The first one I'm using as the base color is a mix of yellow ochre and Quin Sienna. I use yellow ochre as the dominant color with a tiny bit of Quin Sienna, but from time to time I like to change up the ratio, making Quin Sienna the dominant color, but I'm only going to add a little bit because I don't want the base color to be too dark right away. When I'm alternating the colors, I like to continue with a different color while the surface of the area that I've just previously painted is still quite wet. This way, when the paint dries, the color will naturally mingle with each other without any hard edges in between. I'm generally painting with a medium consistency, but as I mix my paint, it doesn't have to be completely blended with each other. In fact, I like to create the uneven surface to depict a bit of texture. Once I've covered the whole area, I like to use a mix with a bit more Quin Sienna in the ratio, and I like to place this in between the edges of where the white decorations are going to be because I want those edges to be very clean, and I try to make sure that there are no white spots. While the surface is still damp, I'm also adding a darker brown around the edges. For this case, I want the light to come from the top, so I'm placing the shadows at the bottom. And for this, I just added sepia with Quin Sienna. This addition of darker color will just give more three-dimensionality to the cookie. As you can see now, the cookie doesn't look as flat as before, and it looks like it's popping out of the paper. Next, I'm adding yellow ochre to the dark brown, so this color mixture has all of the three browns, and I'm going to use this to paint underneath some of the white decorations while the surface is still slightly damp. This will also act as a subtle cast shadow from the white decorations, but I don't want the edges to be harsh, so if your surface is completely dry and you painted hard edges, you can always soften the blend using a clean damp brush, or even re-dampen the surface slightly before adding the dark brown. Now let's move on to the second one, which is the house. I'm starting with the same color mixture of yellow ochre and Quin Sienna. I'm just going to outline the outer portion first using the same color mixture. Then once I've covered the outline, I'm going to add more of the darker value at the bottom. Once I'm done, I'm going to paint the rest of the house, making sure to remember avoiding the roof area of the painting, and of course alternating the color by adding more Quin Sienna in the ratio here and there. I'm not sure if you noticed, but I like to also play a bit with the consistency for the base color, so certain areas has a lighter value because of a lighter consistency, while others has a darker value because of a higher consistency. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to also add the darker brown, and this consists of sepia and Quin Sienna. I'm also going to add the darker brown underneath some of the decorations, especially the roof, because that's going to be all white, and I'm guessing as you pipe a lot of that white icing, that area is going to be quite thick, which means a bit more cast shadow than other areas. So there are basically 3 steps to paint the base color of these cookies, and I'm just going to repeat those same steps for this ginger cookie man. As I'm painting the darker values here, you can see that the paint isn't traveling as much as the previous cookies. That's because the surface is probably already too dry, especially for the right leg here. And when that happens, I just re-dampen my brush and place the excess water by dotting it around the edges of the darker value to reactivate the paint and letting the darker value travel slowly. This will also make the edges more uneven, giving it a more natural transition. So once I'm done, I'm going to move back to the first cookie again. Watercolor always dries a bit lighter, so you can see that the color is a little bit faded. So I'm going to just add the colors that I've already pre-mixed on my palette to add a bit more texture. I just tap my brush randomly. I'm not covering every single area. I like to also sharpen some of the edges by adding more of the darker colors. This time I also added mineral violet to mix with the sepia and Quin Sienna for the darker values, especially right at the edges. And because the mineral violet will make the darker brown more rich and even darker than the previous mixture, I'm only going to place this sparingly around the edges instead of letting it travel too far into the cookie. And that's basically it for the second layer. I'm going to apply this to the rest of the cookies, adding a bit more texture as well as sharpen the edges by adding a darker value. I'm adding a bit extra texture to the gingerbread man because he's covered in less icing, so the cookie is exposed more and it requires more texture in my opinion. I also darkened the value quite a lot for the bottom part of the gingerbread man, so it looks kind of like it's a little bit unevenly cooked. That's basically it for the cookie portion. Next, I'm going to take off the masking fluid, and before you do this, make sure that the painting is bone dry. If it's the slightest bit damp, you will end up damaging the paper as you clean off the sticky masking fluid, so please be really mindful of that. Once you've taken off all of the masking fluid and the white space is revealed, the first thing I want to do is to clean the edges, especially for this complex pattern on the snowflake. I want to make sure that the shapes stay separated from each other and that there are no hard edges, at least to the best of my ability. In terms of the color, I just try to find the tone that best suits the area that you're painting on. So generally it's yellow ochre with Quin Sienna, but sometimes you might even have to add a bit of that darker brown mixture if you need to. I also switched to my small brush here to make sure that the corrections can be clean and delicate. Generally, it's also okay to use a slightly darker tone than the base color, since this will just add to the shadow effect, but don't overdo this, meaning covering every single part with that outline, because it'll end up looking like an actual outline which will flatten your painting. Once I've cleaned the edges for the royal icing, I'm going to add shadows to make them have a subtle pop, because at the moment they're looking quite flat. And for that, I'm going to use one color mixture, which is from Mineral Violet, Gray of Gray, mixed with a bit of yellow ochre, which will turn into this nice creamy tone. And because I don't want this to overwhelm the whole painting or make the icing look too thin if this color is a bit too dark, I just use a very thin consistency, so any shadow here just looks very subtle. In terms of the placement of the shadow, I mostly place them at the bottom area of the icing because again, the light is coming from the top. I'm quite happy with the snowflake, so I'm going to move on to paint the cast shadow for the icing on the house. And since the icing on the roof is applied quite thickly, I'm going to add a thicker line using this creamy color to show that it's more puffy. I'm also going to add cast shadows for the colorful circular candy later on. And as for the rest of the icing decoration, I'm just going to add the same amount of shadow as the ones I've painted on the snowflake. Once I'm done, I'm going to leave this to dry before adding the colorful circular candy because I don't want the risk of those colors bleeding into the cast shadow. So I'm going to do the same thing for the icing on the gingerbread man. Once I'm sure everything is completely dry, I'm going to use the first color, which is a thick consistency of vermilion, and I'm going to place some of the circular candy. And since I want to alternate the colors, I place them in random areas. The next color is Hansa Yellow Medium, which I added a touch of vermilion into to make it a bit deeper. Then I changed up the ratio and added even more vermilion to create an orange. For the rest of the candy, I'm going to create a light green by adding hooker's green into the orange and the yellow mixture. I'm basically done with the cookies, but the composition looks a bit empty, so I decided to add a bit more decoration around the sides, and I just drew out some simple pine leaves as well as holly berries with the leaves. For the pine leaves, I first used a dark brown mix to paint the stem, and then I mixed in sepia with hooker's green to create a dark muted green for the leaves. For the berries, I just use a thick consistency of vermilion, the same as the candy on the gingerbread house, to make it consistent with each other. And while applying the paint, I use the thick consistency while leaving a bit of white negative space for the highlights to make it look shiny. While the surface is still a little bit damp, I added Quin Sienna into the vermilion to create a darker value, and I just place it underneath the berries. Lastly, for the leaves, I just mixed in hooker's green into the yellows and the vermilion that I already have on my palette, which is a similar tone to the candy on the gingerbread house, and I'm just going to color it in. Basically, I want the surface of the leaves to completely dry, so meanwhile I'm going to add the darker values on the berries again. I use a slightly thicker consistency of the darker red. Then I took some of the dark green from the pine leaves and mixed it into the lighter green to add the midribs for the holly leaves. So that's basically it for this painting. I really enjoyed painting this one, and again, you can use the idea as single Christmas card designs as well. If you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more like this, please consider subscribing. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!